Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Joe. I'm Dr. Jonathan Kenyon. So my presentation to start things off today is around exploring the role of the internet in the radicalisation and offending of individuals who've been convicted of extremist offences in England and Wales. Now, very briefly, this presentation is based on a research study that I conducted as part of a professional doctorate in forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University, and that work concluded in 2020. And the findings that I'm going to share with you today have since been published back in September 2021 on the gov.uk website in the form of a Ministry of Justice research report. So if anybody's interested at the end to see that, just let me know and I can provide you with a link for that. So just very briefly, just to set a bit of context to the study. Essentially the rapid expansion of the internet within society has resulted in new risks concerning the spread of violent extremism and extremist ideologies across communities. And it was even as far back as 2007 that the UK House of Commons Home Affairs Committee described online radicalisation and use of the internet by extremists as one of the greatest threats that countries, including the UK, face. And I think, as we've heard about in this presentation over the last couple of days, there's been lots of open questions in this area for practitioners, for academics, and for policymakers. I've put a couple up there, which relate to this study. So, to what extent does the internet act as a replacement for physical interactions? And also, do online networks have the same influence upon an individual as real-world social networks? And of course, due to these knowledge gaps and some unanswered questions, there's clearly a need for further empirical research to test some of these assertions around radicalisation and the internet's role within it. So very quickly, then I'll move on to the current study. So very fortunate in terms of my position within HMPPS to have access to a unique closed-source data set of 269 risk assessment reports that have been completed on individuals who have been convicted of extremist offences. Now, of these 269 reports, they consisted of 267 reports, which were extremism risk guidance reports. Maybe some of you have heard of them as ERG reports, possibly. But that's the main kind of assessment framework that we use for convicted extremists in England and Wales. But there was also a couple of reports which were structured risk guidance reports, known as SRG reports. And that was essentially the predecessor to the ERG. So all in all, within the data set, there was 269 cases. And in terms of the report dates, they ranged from October 2010 all the way through to the end of December 2017. And the way in which the research was conducted was that a detailed coding scheme was developed and then applied manually to the content of all of those reports. And importantly, in terms of the findings I'm going to share with you, the focus of the analysis was on 235 cases of the 269. Now, those 235 cases were coded as radicalised extremists. Now, this was using a definition put forward by Andrew Silk, who described there being 4 types of prison-based extremists. Radicalised extremists was one of those types. And essentially, how he defined radicalised extremists were individuals where there was clear evidence prior to coming into custody of them having developed extremist views or beliefs, and also, crucially, that they'd engaged in extremist activity prior to coming into custody. So as I say, the focus was on the 235 radicalised extremists. When you looked at the sentencing dates for those 235, the earliest was 1982, and it went right through to the end of 2017. So we had essentially like 35 years worth of coverage there. And also what was quite important about the 235, there was sufficient evidence based on the content of the reports to determine the radicalisation pathway based on internet use. So very, very briefly, in terms of what an ERG report is all about, ERG reports are completed by either qualified probation officers or registered psychologists. One of the most important tasks within that ERG report is for the author to provide a narrative or a formulation, basically, which describes how an individual went on their pathway to the point of committing an extremist offence. And the great thing, I think, about the reports is they're a really rich source of information. So the authors, when they're compiling those reports, will have access to a number of closed-source data sources. They'll have things like court transcripts, they'll have police reports, for example. But really crucially, they also have the opportunity to interview the subject of those reports. So I always sort of think in some ways, whilst interviewing individuals themselves about their internet activity would be absolutely fantastic, in some ways this is almost the next best best thing because those individuals have contributed to the development of their reports through interview. So finally, just to say on this, of the 235 cases, I said there was sufficient evidence to determine their radicalisation pathway. They were put within one of three pathway groups. So either they were considered to have primarily radicalised online, so this is known as the internet group, and as you can see there on the slide, 29 cases fitted the bill. There were those that primarily radicalised offline, known as the face-to-face group, of which there were 93 cases. And finally, there was some individuals where clearly both offline and online influences have been key to their pathway, and they were known as the hybrid group and the biggest group, so 113 cases within that group. Super quickly, in terms of the 235 cases, what do they look like? Well, 90% male, so male-dominated, although crucially there is still 10% of females within the sample. As you can see there with age, we've got ranging from 17 all the way up to 63 with a mean age of 29. Slightly weighted more to those over 25, 58%. Majority born in the UK, 73%. And also we've got quite a mixture of ideologies and causes there. So Islamist extremists, 76%, sorry, so that's the biggest group. But we had extreme right-wing, animal rights activists, and then we had this slight catch-all other political group, and within there would be a few far-left extremists or some anti-establishment individuals, or perhaps some individuals that might have been members of, so to say, nationalist or separatist movements, for example. So it was a bit of a kind of a catch-all group. So, in terms of some of the key findings of the study that I'm going to share with you today, so first and foremost, it was found the internet is playing an increasingly prominent role in radicalisation pathways for those convicted of extremist offences. So perhaps no surprise there, given, I think as we were talking about on the panel yesterday, or Maura was talking about on the panel yesterday, that is something that we know we have increasingly used the internet over time. But what you can see there in terms of the face-to-face groups, the orange bar, that's steadily kind of, if like, decreasing over time, whilst for those groups where there's been some level of online involvement, so either the internet group or the hybrid group, you can see generally over time in terms of those sentencing dates, there's been increased kind of use of, or more prominence, sorry, of the internet. However, we stop one short of saying that the online domain is replacing the offline domain, because actually for the majority of cases within the sample, offline influences had at least played some role within the pathway. And I think that's probably most clearly evidenced if you look at the 2015-17 time. The biggest group, the largest group there is still this hybrid group, so clearly offline influences are still playing an important role. We did a little bit of subgroup analysis, so we looked at males, females, younger generation, older generation. Across the board, the internet was increasingly prominent in pathways, but I think it's worth noting it was particularly marked for females, and it was particularly marked for members of the younger generation. And again, that kind of mirrors general societal trends at the time. So I looked at an Ofcom report from 2018, and that reported that for those in the 16 to 24 age group, they typically reported the highest levels of weekly internet use. And also, interestingly, around 2018, it was females that reported being more likely to actually have a social media profile or social media account compared to males. Finally, just looking at that kind of period over time and trends over time, we looked to see about the types of websites, platforms and applications, and have they changed over time? And well, the answer was yes, very much so. So whilst there appeared to be over time a reduction in the use of extremist websites and kind of home pages, and by those I mean they could be official sites by the group or sites set up by supporters, at the same time we were seeing an increased use of open social media platforms, so YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, for example. And again, actually, if you look to the literature and you look at a platform such as Twitter, the golden age of Twitter for Daesh is often described as being around 2013, 2014. So pretty much confirms some of the findings that were out there in the literature anyway. I think in terms of encrypted applications, we started to see some kind of increased use around this sort of period, particularly for the hybrid group, in fact. But as I say, because the data only went up to 2017, it was sort of difficult to say too much about trends beyond that. So the next thing we looked at was whether or not the radicalisation pathway is related to the way those convicted of extremist offences have used the internet. So what we did is we compared the three pathway groups across 8 online activity variables. And what we basically found, internet group compared to the face-to-face group, is internet group more likely to have learnt from online sources, internet group more likely to have used open social media platforms. Let's be honest, no surprise there. But what was really interesting was comparing the internet group with the hybrid group. Of course, the hybrid group also being a group where online influences were seen as quite key to their pathway. And here what we found was that a higher percentage of the internet group had interacted with like-minded others online, had disseminated their own extremist propaganda, and had accessed open social media platforms. And I suppose from a researcher point of view, this was actually quite reassuring because it kind of, I suppose, added a bit of sort of validity to these different categories of kind of pathway group, and that there really were some key differences between each of these groups. Then moving on, we looked at the three pathway groups and compared them in terms of socio-demographic variables and also offence-type variables. I won't go through all the findings on there, but the ones I'll pick out in particular was the one characteristic in terms of socio-demographic variables that really differentiated the internet group from the other two pathway groups, were that they were the most likely to have either a mental illness, personality disorder, or some kind of spectrum condition. And then moving on to look at the offence-type variables, again, the one characteristic that really differentiated the internet group from the other two pathway groups was around the degree of social connection, and that was degree of social connection to other extremists offline. And here we found that the internet group were more likely to be considered lone and also least likely to be a member of a group. I'll just very briefly talk about some findings that were found for the face-to-face group, because I think they're particularly interesting and they really differentiated the face-to-face group from those other two pathway groups. So face-to-face group, most likely to have committed a violent index offence, most likely to have assumed the role of an attacker within the context of their offending, and very interestingly with the face-to-face group, least likely to support an Islamist extremist ideology. And really, you know, looking at that, what we found was actually there was quite a lot of variation in terms of ideology and cause within that group. So finally, the last finding I want to share with you is really the risk assessment side of things in terms of these three pathway groups. So what we found was actually the radicalisation pathway has a real impact on the levels of engagement to an extremist group or cause and the levels of intent and capability to actually perpetrate violent extremist acts. So, in terms of engagement, when I'm talking about engagement, which is this bit over here, what we're talking here, these are factors that may account for an individual's kind of growing involvement or growing identification with an extremist group or cause. And what we found here was that the hybrid group were the group that typically had the highest ratings overall for their level of engagement to an extremist group or cause. And this was a rating provided by the author of those reports. Very interestingly, we found it was actually internet group members that typically had the lowest levels of engagement. Moving on to look at intent. So intent, this is all about factors that evidence an individual's readiness to actually support an extremist group or cause through illegal or harmful or violent activity. What we found here is, once again, it was the hybrid group that had the highest overall ratings for intent. And once again, it was the internet group, so those who primarily radicalised online, that typically had the lowest assessed ratings for level of intent. And finally, capability, which is over this side. So capability is all about those factors that enable an individual to actually carry out violent extremist acts. What we found here, interestingly this time, it was the face-to-face group members that typically had the highest capability ratings, whilst once again it was those who primarily radicalised online, so the internet group, that typically had the lowest levels of capability ratings. So bringing all of that together, what does that mean? Well, what it's indicating is that actually offline extremist contacts, seem to play a really crucial role, not only in supporting and kind of deepening someone's sense of identity with or interest in an extremist group or cause. These offline contacts seem to also play quite an important role in supporting someone's or growing readiness for people to actually commit offences on behalf of that group or cause. And these offline contacts seem to also play quite an important role in actually providing people with things like the networks, the skills, the knowledge, and the resources to actually go on to commit violent extremist acts. So, final slide for you, just some considerations and recommendations to finish off with. So, Yeah, starting off with the rise in the prominence of the internet that was certainly found in our study up to 2017, certainly expected to have continued beyond that. And if you consider the impact of COVID-19, so from sort of early 2020, where we know from some of the kind of early research that people were spending more time at home than ever before, more time online than ever before, and actually some of the restrictions that were in place, meaning offline contact with other people was more difficult during the pandemic. Yeah, we very much expect that to have continued on that basis. And I think the other thing this study really highlights is given those changes in the types of platforms, applications, websites kind of used over the passage of time, it really highlights that constantly adapting threat and just what a difficult task it is for those who are, if you like, tasked with trying to combat or counter this threat when it comes to online radicalisation. The other thing I'll just say very, very briefly, it's not there on the slide, but I think what's quite encouraging is the findings from this study using kind of closed source data, very much focused on convicted extremists, really support some of what we know from the literature that's out there that's relied on quite often open source data or small number case studies. That's quite encouraging in terms of the knowledge that we've got. But we would argue that not only does it confirm what's already known, but perhaps takes things a step further, particularly around that kind of risk assessment element and thinking about pathways and actually the risk that people pose depending on the pathway they've taken. So in terms of just a few recommendations to finish off with, so the first one is around security services and counter-terrorism initiatives should really be targeting the internet, clearly as a setting where extremist socialisation can occur, but not at the expense of offline interactions. As we saw for most cases, it's a combination of both that seem to be quite important, quite critical for their pathway. It made me think about some of the stuff that Paul Gill talks about. You know, we talked about this false dichotomy between the online and the offline, and I suppose in some respects this study supports that in terms of, okay, well, the biggest group was the hybrid group, so yeah. But I'd also argue in some ways it counters that to a certain extent, because the findings from this study, when you separate the pathway groups in this way, suggest there might still be some ongoing merit looking at these groups in this different way, as opposed to sort of thinking, we just don't need an online-offline distinction. And again, something Maura was talking about, and something I discovered a bit when I was looking through the ERGs, it's true that some people really keep their online life quite separate from their offline life, and that was something that shone through from some of these cases. The second recommendation is that online measures should absolutely target younger users. This was on the back of how marked it was for the younger generation in terms of this increased prominence of internet use. But really, really importantly, also appeal to both males and to females, given again how marked we saw it for females. Those identified as vulnerable to online radicalisation. So actually, just before I talk about this point, I think we're getting a bit more of a sense of some of the wider needs of individuals that have committed extremist offences. So where there are people that are identified as vulnerable to online radicalisation, this study suggests that they may benefit from initiatives to increase things like their social opportunities and their networks, so perhaps they're not quite so isolated in many cases, and also referrals to specialist mental health or PD services, of course, where that's appropriate, given that was one of the characteristics that really made the internet group very different, if you like, from members of the other two groups. And finally, further work is, so when we think about those differences between engagement, intent and capability across those pathway groups and sort of considering that from a risk perspective, I think we need to now take things one further and think about, okay, well, how can we now determine what, from a rehabilitation stance, what would be appropriate for people depending perhaps on the pathways taken. And I think we need to really think carefully about intervention, type, and intensity and duration. So, for example, if we're saying that for those individuals, perhaps who primarily radicalised online, you know, they might be less engaged or have lower levels of intent to commit violent extremist acts, well, on that basis, then potentially is a lower intensity intervention more appropriate for those individuals, perhaps something that focuses on positive approach goals, where really the aim is just to try to get them back on track so they're back leading a more positive life. Well, actually, if we're thinking about individuals that perhaps are more highly engaged and have higher levels of intent, so let's take, for example, the hybrid group here, so those that have been subject to influence both in the online and the offline domain, do we need an intervention that's more intensive, that's longer, and perhaps also includes some work that specifically targets extremist beliefs and ideology? And that's it. Cheers.
Thank you so much for that. It was a really interesting presentation.